Hi, I'm David Tipton,
Hi, I'm Scott Tipton. We write Star Trek comics for IDW Publishing,
and are currently working on the Star Trek Mirror Wars miniseries.
and you're listening to Trek Untold.
Hello and welcome to Trek Untold, the Star Trek podcast that goes beyond the stars. I'm your host, Matthew Kaplowitz. There are only so many seasons of Star Trek shows out there because, well, making a TV show costs a lot of money, and don't get me started on the astronomical price of making films. But when it comes to the medium of comics, you can do a whole lot more at the cost of a whole lot less. The expanded Star Trek universe in sequential art form has existed for as long as the original series has, and fills gaps just as much as all the books out there do too. Are they canonical? Well, sometimes, but does that really matter when you find a really excellent story? Case in point, I've been really enjoying what IDW has been doing with their Star Trek franchise that they've had in comics since the mid-2000s. And that includes giving us some truly amazing crossovers that really you could never have in TV shows, including Star Trek crossovers with Doctor Who, Planet of the Apes, and most recently, the Transformers. And in case you're wondering, yes, the Enterprise does transform and get into a fistfight with Megatron. The comics will give us interesting viewpoints and perspectives that we really didn't have a chance to explore in the TV shows, as well as all these amazing battles and all these things that really you can't necessarily do in a TV show because it's just going to cost too much to make. That's why I'm a big fan of comics, and that's why especially I'm super excited to be chatting with today's guests. Scott and David Tipton are brothers who've been writing Star Trek comics since 2007. That list includes the Klingons' Blood Will Tell miniseries, Spock Reflections, the original series Tale Mirror Images, the DS9 Odo murder mystery story Too Long a Sacrifice, the epic Q Conflict miniseries that is one of my favorite things that IDW has done with Star Trek comics in quite some time, and their current Mirror Universe saga, which has been spanning across a few years now, and takes the Next Generation cast and thrusts them into the Mirror Universe in a way we've never seen them before. We're talking drama, we're talking intrigue, we're talking action, and we're talking versions of these characters that are really something we could only ever imagine, and now we've got them in the pages of this awesome IDW comic. So today on Trek Untold, we're going to learn all about these siblings and comic historians and lovers to learn how they write comics together, take a deep dive into some of the miniseries that they've written, examine the entire process of how a comic gets done start to finish, and hear about what they're doing right now with the TNG Mirror Universe comics. So if you thought Trek Untold was nerdy before, you ain't heard nothing yet. We're going page by page and frame by frame into Star Trek comics here with Scott and David Tipton on this week's episode of Trek Untold. But before we begin this week's episode, if you'd like to support this show, please don't forget to follow Trek Untold on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to get the latest updates and all sorts of other fun Star Trek-related content. You can also check us out on Patreon at patreon.com/TrekUntold, where you can support this show for as little as $2 a month. At higher tiers, you can check out the shows before they come out, know about my guests in advance, and even have a chance to ask them questions, among other benefits coming soon. Shout out to our sponsor, Triple Fiction Productions, who create 3D printed toys and prop replicas inspired by Star Trek. Their items come in all shapes and all sizes and are always amazing, but you're going to hear a little bit more about them later on in the show. If you're listening to us on iTunes or any other audio platform that allows for ratings and reviews, please leave us a 5-star rating and a positive review. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe to us at youtube.com/nerdnewstoday and give the video a thumbs up and a comment. Doing any of those things help keep this show growing and allow me to continue bringing you awesome guests and great conversations every single week. Now, without further ado, let's beam in this week's guest. Computer, access interview file. And welcome back to Trek Untold, and things are about to get a lot nerdier than usual because I'm about to geek out over some comics with two writers whose work I am very familiar with and very excited to be chatting with today. We're joined by Scott and David Tipton. Gentlemen, how's it going?
Hi, nice to see you.
So yeah, we got a lot to discuss here. You're actually not our first comic book guest ever. Our first guest was David Baker. He also has done some stuff for IDW and the world of Voyager. But yeah, I love talking comics, and I know you guys are true comic buffs and historians as well. So let's actually back things up a little bit and get focused on Star Trek. Otherwise, I'm going to keep rambling. So I'm going to start with let's start with you, Scott. What's your earliest memory of Star Trek?
Oh, that's easy. I mean, our house was a Star Trek house when I was a kid. KTVU, Channel 2 in San Francisco, every day at 5. David and I and our dad, we watched Star Trek. It's just that it was always there. And if it wasn't Star Trek on Channel 2, it was my Mego Star Trek figures or the Gold Key Star Trek comics. It's always been like a fixture.
I'm glad you already mentioned Gold Key comics. We're going to talk a lot about those, I feel like, today.
Cool.
Scott and I both would read comics a lot as a kid. And we always had comic books around when we were kids. And one of the things we used to read quite often were the old Gold Key comics. And, in those days, the Gold Key comics were new. So you might see them in a spinner at something like a 7-Eleven, or you might find them in trade collections in grocery stores or bookstores. So that's something that we always remember about with Star Trek, is that connection to the Gold Key comics.
Those comics are pretty interesting because, that really is the first Star Trek comic that existed. And there wasn't exactly a style guide at that point either. So, different artists would draw things differently. You'd have key characters be colored in odd colors. They'd be making up all sorts of random aliens. Are there any Gold Key comics from Star Trek that stick out in your mind as ones that are favorites?
Actually, it's been interesting, really. About a year ago or so, at the height of the pandemic, I did a whole sort of tweet run about all the Gold Key comics. And I went through them issue by issue, which was interesting to me because I'd never done that before. I looked at them as a kid, but I never sort of looked at them in issue by issue. So it was interesting to see how they changed over time. People have a lot of assumptions about them. They think they're all bad for some reason, or they think they're all anachronistic, or they think they all got Star Trek wrong. And in fact, if you actually look them over time, the Gold Key comics got better and better, and they got more and more accurate to the show. The early ones, sometimes they had Italian artists that didn't know Star Trek very well, but it didn't stay that way. But people often think that. And over time, when you get up to where the time when Gold Key no longer had the license, their Star Trek comics were really not all that terrible at all. They were actually sometimes quite good. The Gold Key comics in particular really like to do sort of a lot of guys wearing robes, a lot of sort of medieval things going on planets. And there were a lot of sort of monster oriented comics as well in the Gold Key ones, but a lot of them had sort of their own kind of unique feel that wasn't really like the DC or the Marvels later on. What else do you think about Scott?
Yeah, the first few episodes, the first few issues, which, by the way, when I first started, the book was like quarterly or bi-monthly, so they weren't coming out very frequently. And those first few issues, the artists hadn't even really seen the show because it wasn't airing in Italy. So they're working off of like black and white photo ops or press kits. So it's why you get crazy stuff like the Enterprise having flames coming out of the cells, and like all the crew wearing backpacks. And they mistook Janice Rand's beehive hair for like a hat. So it's actually colored like a hat, even though it's not. But later on, once the show became the thing it was, and Gold Key maintained the license for a fairly long time, they kind of did what Star Trek did. Is like all of a sudden we're on the voodoo planet, and there's a crazy there, or we'd be on like they robes, and there'd be like various historical planets with mad historians, or you would get pirate stories. So they kind of did much of the same thing that the TV show did, in that it's kind of taking these science fiction tropes and translating them through the Star Trek lens. But as the show went on, or as the series went on, it got much closer to feeling like as much a good Trek as anything else that's been in comics.
And when I took that look at those Gold Keys, it was the case that in some of those early Gold Keys, because they were dealing with just sometimes black and white images, they got the colors and the uniforms wrong. They were all green. But when the reprints came out years later, they went back and recolored them and fixed it. So that showed they knew that was wrong, and they knew they had to fix it. And that's something that people were kind of really shocked at. What you mean they actually fixed it later? Yeah, they did fix it later on. And so, it was the case. There's some famous stories about some people involved with Star Trek who later on kind of helped out with some of the Gold Keys and got them a little bit more on track for a while. And that played a role in it too. I think with Doug Drexler and some others who, if you look at those Gold Keys as elements of 1970s sci-fi and 1970s comics, they make a lot of sense. You're like, oh, I can see this. They're not really as strange as they might seem. There's a really weird one where Spock goes to some planet and they need help. And to get Spock's help, they enlarge his brain.
Of course.
And they enlarge his entire head. And so
do.
panel after panel, his head gets bigger and bigger. So they would sometimes do things you couldn't do in the TV series. And they knew they were doing that. And then they thought that was kind of funny, actually. And so it's kind of a kick to see those. That's one of the things I really like about them.
Yeah. If I'm not mistaken, also credit is due to, I think Len Wein came in and wrote a bunch of those toward the end of the run.
Yeah.
A lifelong Star Trek fan, during the whole run and through the 70s. So when he came in, it got a lot more Trekkier.
Right, it did. And when you look at the later ones, especially, there's interesting stuff. They bring in McCoy's daughter, which, someone knew something about Star Trek, you kind of slip that kind of stuff in there. And I like to see the goalkeeper.
As a kid,
what's that?
Didn't we have that issue when we were kids with Joanna?
We did.
And there was like a big space bear that had her on top of the tower.
Yeah.
I remember
one of the most famous. It's one of the most famous Gold Key covers. Actually, I think it's actually a pretty sought after one.
I love how I'm bringing up all these old memories from old classic Star Trek comics, and they're a lot of fun to look back on. I mean, during the pandemic too, I started rereading a lot of the old DC Star Trek Next Generation books, because that was like my era of comic reading, and I remember not really liking them as a kid, but I went through the entire run. I think most of that series was written by Michael Jan Friedman, and they're really good, and they did so many things that, like you said, you couldn't do on the TV show because you got a TV show budget. In the comics, you can do whatever you want, and it just gives you so much more freedom to explore things. That's kind of really exciting thing about doing comics.
Yeah, and I'll always be sympathetic to somebody who's doing comics for a show that's currently airing.
Yep.
Because you can't do what they're doing because they don't want you to step on their toes, and they're going to take things in directions you don't know about. So you're really kind of you're fighting the dragon and racing it, but not knowing how you're going to be judged. That's a tough thing to do.
Yeah, and the DC Comics had to deal with that in another way, that new movies would come out and invalidate the stories they'd been telling. And so they'd have to do a reboot of the comic series to take into account, this new movie changed everything that we thought we were doing previously.
So throughout your young age reading comics, do you remember if there was one comic in particular, or maybe even a group of comics or a creator who kind of changed the way that you look at the medium and maybe made you want to actually become part of this industry? And let me start with you, Scott. I mean, do you remember anybody like that?
Oh, the answer's easy for me. It was Mark Gruenwald. Mark Gruenwald was an editor at Marvel Comics in the late 70s and 80s. And back in the day, I was a letter hack. I was one of those guys who was always writing letters that would go in the letter columns. And Mark would always print my letters. And so as I got older and started going to conventions, I would stop by and talk to Mark, and we would get to know each other, and he knew what I liked and didn't like. And Mark was kind of like my mentor in comics. And his run on Captain America is absolutely amazing. It's like a 10-year run. He did the famous storyline in the 80s where the government forces Steve Rogers to stop being Captain America, which is what a big chunk of that recent Disney Plus series took from. He wrote an amazing series called Squadron Supreme. He wrote the first Hawkeye miniseries, which the recent Hawkeye series on Disney Plus also took from. Think about how to write and edit all came from my interactions with the group. He was a great guy who died way too young. He passed away from a heart attack at like I think 40, 41, just as he was about to just after the Marvel DC crossover hit. So he was like at the most influential point of his career, and then suddenly he was gone. It was just a horrible tragedy to bum me out, but Gru was the guy for me. Gru was my comic book go-to.
And how about you, David? Was there any comic book creator that kind of left an indelible mark on you and made you want to go into this and look at comics in a different way?
Well, there's a couple things. I mean, one thing is that no one really grows up and thinking, oh, I'm gonna be a comic book writer, and it just happens. It doesn't really work that way. I wish it did. Everybody wishes it did, but it doesn't quite work that way. But I mean, as far as an influence like that goes, the one person I can think of and who I actually got to meet was Harlan Ellison. And I remember I knew Harlan's work going way back. And then when I was in college, oddly enough, I kept getting assigned some of Harlan's work in different classes. So it was really something special for me when Scott and I got to work with Harlan on the City in the 80 Forever project. And I'd always been a big fan of Harlan's work, the way Harlan thought about things. And Harlan was more than just a single kind of, he didn't really think about just a single kind of genre. I mean, Harlan wrote books on all kinds of things. And so that was always part of the background of my thinking about how Harlan looked at things as well.
I don't know about you, but I often still go on YouTube and I check out Harlan's old YouTube channel. It's still just like a hotbed of really great information, also just a lot of fun rants.
Yeah, there's a lot of rants.
Yeah.
Harlan and rants go together.
It still surprised me to this day that I wound up being in a place where, you know, Harlan was our friend, and you know, I was at his house and we hung out, and we went out to dinner, and he was Harlan's biggest secret was that he didn't want anybody to know he was a good guy. He was. And so the fact that all that material with Harlan is on the internet, I find it's a comfort. It's nice to be able to go back there and kind of like, you know, hang out with Harlan again for a little bit, because
you know, up close and personal, the man was a sort of force of nature. One time we were at Blast Off Comics, a store that Scott used to work with Jed Meyer in the store, and we had Harlan there for a signing. We also had J.K. Woodward there. We had Chris Rolfe, Mighty W there. And Harlan was in full Harlan mode. He was signing stuff on paper, harassing people, signing stuff on the front. I'm sorry. And then, like I said, he was in full Harlan mode. He was harassing people. People were coming up and talking to him, and he would give them a hard time, somewhat facetiously, sometimes not. And there was a point where I went to the back rooms, like, I kind of need a break from Harlan for a little bit. And I go back there, and there's Scott and Chris and JK, and they're all back there hiding out from Harlan too. And it's like, I looked at them, they're like, yeah, we just need a little bit of a break from Harlan. We're doing fine, but yeah.
I think JK and Chris and I were passing around a bottle, like, I need a shot. And Harlan, I didn't mean to interrupt you, David, but I just wanted to add, Harlan came into the store swinging a sword.
Oh, yes.
Because he thought that was necessary.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. At some point during that day, he showed me a pocket knife too. And
yeah, he did pull a knife on you, which I thought was the best thing about it is he pulled a knife on you and you just didn't even blink. He just again was like, dude, come on. And he just shook his like, oh, all right.
I think that's the first story I've had on this podcast about someone about to get shivved by Harlan Ellison. So that's pretty great.
Yeah.
You just completely no-sold it. It was great.
Yeah. I mean, I have another Harlan story, which is kind of amusing. Chris Rawl went to the Las Vegas Star Trek show with Harlan. And at one point, Harlan was a little under the weather at this point. He was riding around in one of those little sort of, what do you call them, Scott? A rascal. So it's a little motorized device to help him get around. I mean, he could still walk, but it was because when you go to a convention, it's a lot of walking. He was using this little rascal to help him get around. And at some point, when they were, I guess, setting up the booth, Harlan revved up the rascal and rammed into the booth and ran over Chris Rolfe from IDW. And at some point, Chris was looking up and seeing Harlan looking down at him with the motorcycle like this.
Chris described it as the scene you always see whenever Snoopy would run by with the blanket and knock out Linus, and Linus would be in the air with his feet completely in the air. That was Chris.
And I've always wanted to see a J.K. Woodward painting of that scene myself.
It sounds like someone needs to make a private commission right there. I would like to see that too. Yes. I love that visual you just gave me, Scott, with the Peanuts characters. That's like perfect image. Yeah. So yeah, I'm kind of curious to know, did you guys always write comics professionally together, or was there a time where you guys were doing your own kind of separate things? I mean, when did you two join forces?
I had a bit of a head start. I got to know Chris Ryle through advertising, and then Chris got the job running one of Kevin Smith's websites. He brought me in to help run that. So Chris and I ran the movie poopshoot.com, which was his offshoot from one of the Jay and Silent Bob movies.
That was Kevin Smith's website at the time.
Yeah. And
which was a name drawn from one of Kevin's movies.
Yeah. And then from that, Chris eventually got the job at IDW as editor-in-chief. And when he got the job, I'm like, look, I had always planned on trying to get into comics, but then whenever Mark Grunewald passed away, I kind of lost my passion for it. And so instead I moved to LA and I got into advertising. But I told Chris, like, if there's ever something that comes up you think I'd be good for, give me a call and I'll give it a try. And I did a couple of horror anthologies for him, and that was fun. And then I started writing Angel and Spike comics for IDW. And then they got the Star Trek license about a year after I started writing Angel and Spike. And that was when I said, hey, look, I'm not saying just give me the job, because I know you can't just give me the job, but open the door, let me pitch it. This is what I want to do. This I can do this. And so I pitched IDW and CBS on a Klingon take on Rashomon, where we would look at all the Captain Kirk stories with Klingons from the Klingon perspective.
That was the Blood Will Tell series, right?
On that. I think I helped you on that pitch. It was.
Oh no, I did, but at the time you weren't actually writing, and so you did help. You definitely helped you develop the pitch.
The first project we worked on was actually the Astro Boy project.
No, Astro Boy was a couple years later.
I don't think so.
No, because I remember specifically because you hadn't written comics, and I said, look, just do the first one, and if you don't like it, you have to do it again. But on this first Trek comic, I know that I'm going to be coming to you for advice because we both think the same way about Star Trek, and if you like it, we'll keep doing it. We'll check the numbers later.
You're going to start playing the Amok Time fight music. You guys can just duke it out all. Whoever's the winner gets the story.
Regardless, there was only like about a 1 year jump between whenever I started writing comics and then whenever David and I started working on Star Trek.
And at that time, IDW, something like Star Trek was pretty new at IDW. I mean, they were just getting into more licensed material at that time.
Yeah, they had just at the same time pretty much gotten both Ninja Turtles, and either just before or just after was when they got G.I. Joe and Transformers.
Yeah.
So all these licenses suddenly hit them at once.
Yeah. There was a lot of things going on in the comic market at the time that sort of led to that, which we don't need to go into all those details, but there was a lot of, it was a period of rapid change in licensed comics, basically. Yeah.
It's kind of funny that Star Trek is actually what brought you guys together. You basically just answered like 2 questions in one shot for me. So great job in doing that, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that series you guys are talking about was, it was the Blood Will Tell miniseries, right? So how do you approach a story with Klingons? Because that's kind of I mean, you guys have had to deal with some really interesting Star Trek characters, but Klingons, they really are practically a universe of their own, right? So how do you guys handle working on a Klingon?
I mean, it all comes, I mean, and David, correct me if you think I'm wrong, it all comes from the original material. And especially from the original material of the time what we're doing. Since that one was focused mostly on original series and the films, then we tried to look at everything Klingon from that perspective and just look at everything that's laid out and then go from there.
Boy, that book's a while back at this point, but I mean, I think I think what we were thinking about at the time was we really were trying to do it from very much a Klingon perspective, and we used the sort of development of the Klingons that we saw in Next Gen to flesh out what in some ways was a story about a original series Klingon. Is that right, Scott?
Yeah.
Yeah. And, one of the things that Next Gen did with the Klingons is they made them a little bit less of sort of generic bad guys who seemed like they might be the Russians.
Yeah. I mean, a classic Klingon, especially for the TV show, is much more a little bit kind of a sweaty mustache twirling bad guy. And and even the movies kind of kept, I mean, the Klingons especially in Star Trek 3, they're just bad. I mean, there's nothing good about Christopher Lloyd's crew. He's a villain. But Next Gen really tried to flesh them out and make it more of a culture.
And Next Gen had no choice because they put Worf on the bridge.
Right.
So Klingons could no longer be simple, these are just, cut and dry villain bad guy characters. And so
you can't be the one good Klingon.
Right. And so I think that was part of what we were thinking about with that series is, okay, how do we sort of develop that and show that Next Gen version of the Klingons? and tie it in going back to Klingons in the original series.
Right. And we would occasionally get bumps in the road, like when we started to tackle the Trouble with Tribbles issue. The whole question of Arn Darvin, who is a Klingon agent disguised to look like a human. Because we also had to tackle the whole Boneheads versus not Bonehead Klingon, which even at that point, I think Enterprise had just kind of touched on it. So we decided, well, it's a more interesting way to tackle the story if this was a ridged head Klingon who had to go through horrible surgery to look like a human, and actually give that story a bit more weight than just say, oh, this is one of the classic ones who just needs to, like, you know, get a little skin lightening and look a little less devious all the time.
Yeah. And then I think the other part of that is we had what was at the time an emerging new artist who was someone who was really good at getting across the kind of details you're talking about, Scott. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It was one of David Messina's first big licensed books. And we had no idea when we got to work with him how big a Star Trek fan he was.
And something about his art really led and lent to that characterization and that portrayal of the Klingons that I'm not even sure I know we were not expecting that when we started.
No, that was the one thing we have had great fortune with during our entire IW run is they've always, without fail, gotten us great artists.
Yeah, and in a lot of cases, we've got artists that were just breaking, just sort of IDW introduced them, and now they've gone on to big things.
Yeah, I mean, Rachel Stott, Elena Casagrande, David Messina, all these guys went on to like, you know, do other great stuff, which is fantastic, you know.
I mean, as a comic book reader who's enjoying these books, I can totally agree with those statements. It's all been really great work there. And I like what you said a few minutes ago also about kind of like adding the Rashomon elements to the Klingons too, because I've always felt like the Klingons, you know, we know that they're a warrior race, but it always has felt like very nondescript. So, you know, I feel like bringing in samurai ideology is a pretty smart way to really cement their kind of warrior status.
Yeah, which is what the show did later on. And so we kind of took that note from TNG. And I mean, when we first started talking about it, I think, this is what you were talking about, David, when we first started actually developing this idea. I love the notion that for the Klingons, everything they're trying to do during that period, and Kirk just shows up again. And there's Kirk again. This guy's killing us. So I love that notion of Kirk being like this perpetual thorn in their side.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny, in some of the later movies, they sort of touch on that note that the Klingons are just tired of him.
Now, Scott, David, you guys also wrote a miniseries I really, really enjoyed, and that was the Q Conflict, which came out a few years ago. In my mind, it's almost kind of like comparable to Marvel's Secret Wars, because you're basically taking, you know, Kirk, Picard, Janeway, and Sisko, getting the best of their crew together to essentially have a war where these omnipotent beings are using them as their pawns. And it's such a cool miniseries. I love it a lot. I'd like to know, like, did you guys go to IDW with that idea? Did they come to it with you? How did this all come together, and how did this massive Q war come together? It's so cool. I'm nerding out. Sorry, guys.
Kind of came to us. This was a Greg project, right, Scott?
Credit where it's due. This was a Greg Goldstein.
Yeah, Greg Goldstein came to us.
He was the president at the time. And normally on the vast majority of our books, it's usually us coming up with an idea cold and pitching it to them. And sometimes that'll lead us to where they say, we like this, give us more of it. And sometimes it'll be stuff where we're trying to figure out how to do this. But on that one, there was the only time where I think it was absolutely a cold call, where I was sitting in my office and I got a call from Greg, who we knew, but Greg Goldstein never called me. So I look at my phone and it says Greg Goldstein. I'm like, well, this could be good or not. So he goes, I'm thinking we need something big for Star Trek. I want you to do something big. I want you to get every crew involved.
And then we had these great couple of meetings with Greg after that, where Scott, Greg, and I just hashed this thing out. And sometimes when you have those kind of meetings with comics, it's a slog, because you're thinking about, okay, what does the market want? What's the licensor want? What would actually work? What is not going to look like it's too much of another team up or another crossover? And so we had these great meetings with Greg where we sort of hashed, okay, well, what about this? What about this? And was fascinating stuff. And so we hashed out this plan, and then we took it to CBS, and they liked it a lot too. So it was one of my favorite projects in terms of the genesis of it. I think probably you might think the same thing, Scott.
Yeah, no, it was just Greg was so excited about it, and it's
He was,
and he admitted he was also the one who fought for years to get Star Trek Planet of the Apes done.
Yeah.
Greg was the one to really muscle that together, and he was the one that came to us and look, we've had this with other people, and nobody can crack it. You guys should be the ones figuring it out. What do you think? And David and I were both Planet of the Apes fans, so of course we're like, absolutely, we'll do it. And just a side note, not to veer away from Q, but on that one, we write up the pitch, and we send it off to CBS and to Fox and IDW, and the note comes back to us as, we really like this, but can you make it apier? We can definitely make it apier. But with Q, it was just, that was very much just something that came to us and said, I want something big. Let's talk about it.
Yeah. For me, one of the best things about that series was I really liked to be able to integrate Q into that story and get Q right, which I think is hard to do.
Yeah.
I'm not always the biggest fan of the crossover type stories, but in this case, because Q is there, to me, it made more sense. Because normally with crossovers, like, well, how does that happen? Well, in this case, well, how does that kind of thing happen? Well, the only thing that could really do that is Q. So to me, that made a crossover make more sense, even though it was an internal crossover with Star Trek. But having Q there kind of allowed us to throw caution to the wind and make it a Q type story and make a crossover story work a little better than it might otherwise, I think.
And it also really helped that specifically the original series has a lot of godlike aliens.
Sure does.
So there was enough of those that it wasn't just Q, and we could actually have factions, and we could really play with some of those dynamics.
To me as a fan, like one of my favorite comics IDW did in the last few years was their Transformers vs. G.I. Joe miniseries. And to me in my head, that was like basically they just got all their toys together, threw them on the floor, and just kind of played with them and made a comic around it. And I felt like the Q Wars is basically kind of the same thing, where you got just all these characters, you pulled everybody out of your toy box and you had them all play together, and that's just what was so beautiful about doing that book.
Throughout the entire writing of that series, I don't know, David, if you did this, but because by the second episode or issue, we had the draft where each would have to draft their own team. I had a piece of paper stuck next to my monitor with tape that had every team and who was on it, just to make sure I was getting around to everybody and everybody was getting a moment in each issue. We're trying to, because there's just so many plates we had spinning with that book.
Yeah, if there's sort of a weak point of that book, it might be having that many people can be hard. And like Scott said, I actually had a diagram up too, because well, all right, if we're going to do this, you got to do everybody that we said we're going to do. And I liked the way that having Q there made an artificial situation seem more real in a way, because
it gave it license to happen in a way that we couldn't do without Q.
Yeah.
And just in terms of your Secret Wars reference, there is one spread in the series that's a direct homage to Secret Wars.
Oh, now I need to go back and reread it. See, how did I miss that? I've been out nerded, sir. Excellent job.
Trek Untold will return momentarily.
Trek Untold is brought to you by Triple Fiction Productions. Triple Fiction Productions produces affordable and unique 3D printed Trek-inspired products from the original series, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, and the movies. Ranging from prop replicas to use in a fan film or cosplay, to accessories or playsets for figures in all different sizes, Triple Fiction Productions has got you covered. Past pieces for toys have included large centerpieces like 10 Forward from the Enterprise D, shuttlecrafts complete with working lights, and the Voyager Bridge, with smaller pieces including Borg alcoves, the Genesis device, and the dreaded arch-enemy of Worf, barrels. All highly detailed products are 3D printed and hand-painted in the USA, with new items added all the time, while simultaneously improving their printing quality based on fan feedback. To learn more about their products, visit triple-fictionproductions.net or visit them on Facebook at facebook.com/triplefictionproductions. Want to get 10% off your next purchase? Use code UNTOLD10 at checkout to receive this discount. Not applicable during sales or clearance events. That's code UNTOLD10 to get 10% off action figure dioramas, accessories, and prop replicas. Triple Fiction Productions, taking Star Trek where no 3D printer has gone before.
Hey, I'm Licia Nav, aka Ensign Sonia Gomez from Star Trek TNG, and now Captain Sonia Gomez on lower decks with her own ship, the Archimedes. Yay! I finally got a promotion after 25 years. So anyway, I'm here to talk about drivebydogooders.org. It's a little charity I run where we go to the outskirts of Skid Row, and from our car windows, we hand out basic human essentials like water, wipes, cold stream cheese, socks, tarps, masks, t-shirts, things to keep people warm. So we just think that everyone deserves clean water, some protein, and a way to clean themselves, especially during Corona. We also hand out masks to those who really, really need it, who live in tents on the street, mainly the disabled and elderly who have a really hard time getting to services. And we do all of this with no agenda, just pure giving, no overhead. If you'd like to go to the website and donate, it's 100% tax deductible. And if you click on the donate button, you can go right to the $35 option and pick a signed autograph picture of either the Star Trek The Next Generation or Lower Decks, or Total Recall, where I played the three-breasted mutant hooker on Mars, and that's the X-rated version. Put in the comments section your address and anything you'd like me to write, and I'll personally inscribe it and mail it off to you immediately. And again, that's drivebydogooders.org. Captain Sonia Gomez, signing off.
We now return to Trek Untold.
I want to jump into what you guys are working on right now, which is the Mirror Wars series. But you guys actually have a little bit of a history doing the Mirror Universe stuff, because I think one of your earlier books also was also about the Mirror World. And that was Mirror Images, right? That was
Right.
the original crew.
Yeah, that one was the basic thrust of that was how Kirk got the Enterprise from Pike in the Mirror Universe.
That Mirror series isn't really related to our later Mirror stories at all, really. I think that Mirror series was only a 4-issue, Scott, maybe 4.
It was a 5, and there was one because there's the 1-issue interlude with Picard in the middle.
That was all original series except for the one Picard in the middle.
Yeah, it was a very young Picard aboard Stargate.
Yes, it was very young Picard, and so it didn't lead to what later became the later Mirror stories. It kind of stands alone, I think.
Yeah, but there's nothing in that goes against anything we have here.
No, I think we've managed to do that. Which one of the things that's difficult is keeping Mirror stories straight over time, because it's hard enough keeping Star Trek canon straight, and then you've got Mirror Star Trek canon.
And then also with the rise of new Star Trek series, and they've begun dipping into the Mirror Universe, making sure that what we do does not go against what they're doing also. So it's tricky.
And for folks who are listening to this interview for the first time and haven't really read these comics yet, this Mirror saga, if you will, this is basically like the grand opus of the Star Trek Mirror Universe right now. So we've had Mirror Broken, I believe, was first, and then we got Through the Mirror, and then followed by Terra Incognito, and I think now we're up to the Mirror War. I think that covers everything, right? So, I always found it odd that TNG on the TV show never really touched the Mirror Universe. I mean, I kind of know why they didn't, rather. But the comics did. Michael Jan Friedman, I don't know if you guys are aware, he actually did in his TNG comic run, he did touch on the Mirror Universe, and he actually brought that in.
Yeah.
I think on TNG, reason why, well, like you said, there's a number of reasons why TNG didn't do it in the actual episodes. One of the reasons I think was that there was a tendency during the Next Generation run to try to not overdo stuff that had been done a whole lot in the original show. I mean, that's why you got to look really hard to find an Andorian anywhere in Next Generation.
I think tendency is putting it very, very lightly. It was really more of a draconian mandate.
Yeah, and so they were touchy about, and it may go all the way back to the Naked Now when they were accused of, what are you just doing, redoing the original show again? So they were super sensitive about that in some ways. And so I think, especially after what happened with Naked Time and Naked Now, if they had done a Mirror episode, they didn't want to hear that again. So I think there was a tendency to stay, but those things come and go. By the time they got to Deep Space Nine, later on, they didn't have any problem doing some mirror stories. So these things evolve over time in TV series, just like they do in comics too.
All right, now for folks who have been living under a Horda for the past few years, I was wondering if one of you guys would mind kind of filling in our new audience, our new comic book readers, about what's going on currently in this Mirror Wars saga. What are we up to right now?
Since there had never been next-gen versions of the Mirror Universe, we had an opportunity to kind of come in and just hit the ground running and do pretty much what we wanted, thanks to the gift of these great concepts that we got from J.K. Woodward, who had been commissioned by John Van Citters at CBS to create the next gen look of Mirror Universe. And so they came to us with these great designs for all the characters for the mirror versions of Picard's crew. And I say, okay, now here, go ahead and tell us the story. And we, from the looks of these characters that JK gave us, it was where we kind of decided what the story would go from. And we pick up with the Terran Empire is down to nothing. It's really been pinned back down to Earth. In the very first beginning of our books, we have Picard scheming to steal what he's heard is this miraculous new ship, which is the Enterprise D. And then once he has his hands on that ship, then it's more of Picard's ambition going on as he thirsts for more power and more ways to get the Empire out of the situation they're in.
And the pivot point in all of this is that the design work that J.K. Woodward did when he was working with CBS was that the problem normally with thinking about, well, why wasn't there any Star Trek Next Generation mirror stories, is because according to the timeline established in Deep Space Nine, the Terran Empire fell. And so our stories explain that, okay, the Empire did mostly fall, but there's sort of a rump version of that Terran Empire that's still surviving on Earth and has been sort of pinned in very tightly by the Klingons and Cardassians, but they're still there and they're still struggling, but they're still around. And our story has been how Picard helps to lead that re-emerging Terran Empire.
Yeah, and the tales that were being told out on Terek Nor and DS9 that the Empire had fallen completely, whereas propaganda being spread by the Klingon Cardassian Alliance to quash any hope of any surviving humans that the Empire had a chance.
Which comes up in Deep Space Nine. They talk about the great propaganda that the Klingon Cardassians were using against Terrans. So, yes. So that sometimes people ask, well, I thought we heard that there was no Terran Empire anymore. But in fact, there are actually some little seeds there that are in Deep Space Nine that fit into the story we're telling.
And Picard's journey here is taking those seeds and growing them into his way to lead the Empire back to greatness.
Yeah, it's very cool you guys are able to tie that in because, this isn't just a TNG book. This is a TNG and, a little bit, spoiler alert, a little bit on into the series too. We do get a little bit of some Deep Space Nine action happening. So that's some really cool stuff there too.
Yeah. So around the covers, there's no spoilers.
Fair enough. For anybody who
I know that J.K. Woodward constantly gets questions about this, about how can this be? And J.K. Woodward has his answer ready to go. So, and J.K., at his covers, you can kind of see his response to those questions sometimes.
So we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier in the interview, but I'm curious, how deep does Paramount and the franchise owners, how deep are their hands in the creative process here? And keeping in mind this Mirror Universe book right now, it's pretty much uncharted territory. So you guys have kind of free reign, I would imagine. But, how much say at the end of the day does Paramount have in what the final product looks like?
Well, they always look at everything and they approve it. And so, sometimes people ask, well, how can I put this? The question that I think, and it's not just even in Star Trek, any kind of licensed product, they always ask, well, how do you get anything done? But don't they tell you what to do? Well, the thing is that if Scott and I didn't have at least some idea how to do this in such a way that they'd be happy with it, they wouldn't come to us to do it. I mean, they're not going to hire the people who would do a terrible job with their license. So, what we turn over to them usually isn't stuff that they think, oh, this is terrible. What are we doing? So usually and part of that's because we do know Star Trek pretty well, and so we know what would work and what would not work with the license. And this could be Star Trek, it could be Star Wars, it could be anything. And so, the secret of working with the licensor is to do something creative within the world and the parameters they have. So they don't tell us what to do because that's what they're paying us for, if that makes any sense.
They have total say and total approval, but they don't tell us what to do because they've already bought off on the idea we brought them, and that's what they want.
And of course, on top of that, they need someone to write this for them. They don't want to write it all individually themselves, so that's why they're paying creatives to write this stuff. So
the last thing they want to do is come in and have to rewrite somebody else's thing that doesn't go with a canon.
Or write it from scratch.
Yeah. But I mean, they are very involved. I mean, Marion and John and Risa at CBS, they read every script, and also
Dayton Ward's been involved in this.
Dayton Ward also, they read every script and they give notes, but it's never changed the story because they've already approved the story before we even started. Because we submit them a full synopsis.
I mean, sometimes we might pass them a little bit of a curveball, but that's all right. But
yeah. But there's never been a time when we toss them a curveball they hate it.
No, something that's completely out of what we were expecting. Yeah. But it's fun in the sense that you're working with other people who actually know this material so well, and they have good feedback for us as well, because it's just me and Scott. And so when Scott and I hash something out, it's like, geez, I wonder what everybody else might think about this. What does it work for somebody else? And maybe even not even for a Star Trek point of view, maybe it's not like, oh, you got that the color of that Klingon shirt wrong or whatever. Maybe it's like, oh, is that what you really want to do there? So yeah, let me think about that a bit.
Is that too much? Especially with Mary, you could get into is that too much territory pretty easily. Yeah, but I mean, they always have good notes, and they'll often have a lot of good suggestions that we will incorporate. And sometimes we'll take those suggestions and turn them into like running bits because we're like, that is a good idea.
Yeah, the really hard thing with Mirror is, especially as the Mirror TNG stories have played out, we have protagonists that are fundamentally
awful.
Awful. They're not evil. They're not evil.
No.
Well, they can be evil, but they're awful. and if we make them less awful, we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing.
Right. It's walking because you want your readers to like and enjoy these characters. So you want them to do things that are cool and look great, but at the same time, they can't be too heroic, and they can't be too. A lot of the things that normally you would use to have a reader admire your characters, you can't do too much of. So it's a tricky line to walk.
And also, Mirror characters are not opposite characters, which sometimes people get that sort of mistaken understanding. You think that, well, is Mirror Picard the exact opposite of Jean-Luc Picard? Well, he is and he isn't. But what happens, and it's where it gets interesting, is that there are elements of Mirror Picard that are opposite, but sometimes they're opposite in good ways. Mirror Picard is better at dealing with other people than Jean-Luc Picard Prime is. Mirror Picard actually knows how to work a room in a way that Jean-Luc Picard can barely even handle one kid on his bridge. And so
I'd argue Mirror Picard's a better motivator.
Oh yeah, no, he is.
Yeah, he's much better at working with people.
Yeah.
Because he's kind of willing to manipulate in a way that Prime Picard is not.
Right.
But we often tell people it's not Bizarro World, it's Mirror Universe. So it's not just opposites.
And when we do that, that goes back to the Mirror episodes of the original show and the Mirror episodes on Deep Space Nine as well. Mirror Spock wasn't an exact opposite of Prime Spock. In fact, actually, he had these redeeming qualities, which makes the whole existing later Mirror universe work.
Yeah, I like that distinction that you made there, because I think that's an important thing to note, is that, they're awful people, but they're not evil. They're not going to start kicking puppies just because it's fun. So, I'd like to ask on that same note, here in the Mirror Wars right now, you have a lot more time, a lot more freedom to really flesh out all of the characters. I mean, we've got Data doing stuff, we have Troy doing things. Everybody's contributing to the story right now in different ways, and we're really learning about who they all are. So I'd like to know, who have you guys had the most fun playing with and writing about in this kind of mirror version of them?
The one that I think we weren't expecting to make as much use of, and we did, is probably Barclay.
Oh yeah, I was going to say Barclay hands down. And that was a complete accident.
Barclay we did not go into this thinking that Barclay would be sort of the pivot point anti-hero hero of the mirror universe for TNG.
He wasn't even in the original pitch.
No.
Because as this worked out, we started with the series, and then through some publishing stuff, they came back to us and said, "Oh, by the way, not only are you doing the series, but you're going to get this year's free comic book day book."
Yeah.
And we'd already written number 1, and I said, "So go write it." Or we hadn't written number 1 yet, but we had started to. They're like, "Now go write it as 0, and I don't know, figure it out." And so that's where we came up with the idea of using Barclay as our kind of intro character to that world. But we had no idea that Barclay was going to be as involved as he was. That's the one time we kind of varied a little bit, because I remember joking about it. It's like, Mirror Universe Barclay should just be a badass. That's the one time I kind of did a little bit of Bizarro versus opposite, but we didn't go heavy on where he's not like a complete badass.
And he is, but he isn't too. I mean, in other ways, he's really kind of lame, just like regular Barclay. I mean, one of my favorite scenes in any of the mirror stories, I think it's Carlos Nito, right, Scott, where Barclay and Troy are talking, and Mirror Barclay is outraged at how his counterpart is treated. He can't believe that Prime Barclay is treated so badly, and he goes into a fit about it. And Mirror Troy just starts laughing hysterically about it. And there's something there that's where that mirror sort of twist is fun and interesting, because what you get is you get a little bit of the Prime character with that sort of mirror twist to it that ends up being kind of amusing, I think. And Carlos's art in that is just great. That's one of my favorite sequences. I just love those panels.
Yeah, I actually want to follow up a little bit about the artwork in the books, because they've all been really great. And I'm curious to know, in terms of how you guys write your comics, I mean, are you specifically giving them layouts? Are you kind of constructing how the page looks? Or are you the kind of guys that let your artists kind of have freedom and run with their whatever ideas they have?
It's full script. So every page, there is the panel count and a rough layout. But we're also telling in terms of how the panels are arranged on the page. But every full descriptions for every panel and full dialogue. But we also tell them, look, you guys are great artists. You're going to know how to make this page really sing. If you can think of a way to improve it, by all means, give it a try. Run it by us, as long as it doesn't change the panel count or the pacing.
We're even a little more looser than you're suggesting compared to some other writers.
Well, I think we've gotten more loose over the years as we've gotten such good artists.
Yeah, I mean, I always know that. And in fact, on this most recent one with Gavin, there have been multiple pages where I'm sort of kind of hoping that Gavin will, and he's always done it, use his own creativity on some of the actual arrangement of the panels on a page. And I never have any problem with that. I mean, there's a reason why we have artists, and because they can do that kind of thing a little bit better sometimes than I can.
Yeah, but back to go with what you're saying, with issue 1, we were doing a lot more, I think it's a more detailed panel breakdown and page breakdown, because we'd never worked with Gavin before. And by the time we got that first issue 1 back, we're like, oh, we're going to be fine. And then we kind of loosened back up to the same way we worked with Messina or the JK, where we trust the artists to do it.
Yeah, and even going back, if you look at some of our earliest scripts compared to what we do now, we're much less likely to sort of insist upon panel count pages in the way that we used to, I think. Scott, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, if adding a panel will increase a beat and give us a more dramatic point, and we're like, absolutely, try it.
Yeah, I think
when you do that, sometimes you get great. Yeah, you can get great surprises. Like, for example, on Star Trek Planet of the Apes, by the 3rd issue, Rachel. This is Rachel Stott's first series. By issue 3, she had really gotten her speed up, where she was really, really killing it. And we have this one scene where we have Kirk chasing Taylor Charlton Heston through the corridors of the Enterprise. And when we got the page back, it was just like from above shot that was like an old family circus strip where you would see Jeffy running around the backyard. And we're like, oh, that's genius. And we hadn't asked for that. Like, that's absolutely great.
No.
That's what, when you have a great artist that you trust,
Yeah.
you get those kind of benefits.
And there's a number of pages like that in Seated on the Edge of Forever where JK took what we had and he made it better.
And well, the most famous one is the one he refuses to sell.
Oh yeah, he still has that.
in the fifth issue, the big climax page, it's where you see the Beckwith get punished. He came up with this gorgeous kind of like pinwheel design to it, and yeah, I think it's last I heard it was still up at his house.
Yeah, and I think Scott and I, we do put down the number of pages, we break it down by panel, but it's always been the case that we leave the artists some room to do that layout and get that the way that they think it's best. I mean, there was a scene in a most recent Mirror story with Picard racing through San Francisco in a car. And I sort of went back and forth about how much do I want to give Gavin details of how to do it and how much do I want to let him do it on his own. And I didn't give a whole lot of details. I left him lots of room there, and he did a great job with it. It's just fantastic. It's really great panel layout. Great stuff. Yeah.
But I think we also did tell him what our influence was, and I think he went and watched Bullet, and I think that helps.
Yeah, that was really, really cool. Somebody on Twitter the other day mentioned the fact that why does it say 1973? But Bullet came out in 68. I didn't tweet back, but the reason why we did it in 1973 is because I wanted to put the Trans-American Pyramid into the story. And the Trans-American Pyramid did not exist at the time of Bullet, but existed a few years later. And so when Picard makes this big turn right next to the Trans-American Pyramid, I couldn't do it the same year as Bullet, so I just put it a few years later. I thought no one would possibly think about that. And of course, on Twitter, someone caught it and said, "Oh, all right."
I'm not going to nitpick. I just like the fact that Picard is a fan of Steve McQueen. That's kind of a cool thing to have.
Yeah, exactly. And then Gavin gave him an NCC 1701D license plate on his car.
One of the things that's really fun too about the whole Mirror saga that's going on right now is that you guys get to have a lot of tertiary characters pop in. Like we've seen the outrageous Okuna show up. We just saw in one of the most recent issues, Ensign Sonia Gomez. I mean, she's not a captain yet; she's still an ensign right now. So I'm hoping maybe we'll get to see like a Mirror Universe version of the Traveler to meet Mirror Wesley. That'd be really cool. But I'd like to know, and I know you probably can't even say anything about this, but I have to ask, or else my listeners will riot. Any other characters that maybe might pop up in surprises coming up in the next few issues?
Well, there was one in the most recent one. That was Leland T. Lynch came back. I don't think of any others recently.
Just to let you know, if it makes a difference to me, I'm not expecting you guys to actually give me a real answer for this question. I don't want you guys in trouble. So yeah, you can answer accordingly with that information.
No, there will be surprises coming, but
because we're getting closer to the end, there's a little bit less room for some of those.
Right. So it's more about bringing everything together.
Yeah, those are always tough because on one hand, we don't want to put them in just for the sake of them being there. It's like, woohoo, you got the barber or whatever. What's
gotta have
barber? Yeah, Mirror Mott.
He has an afro.
People are dying in the way.
Now I regret that we didn't get Mirror Mott in there. Damn it.
Yeah. Probably a bunch of bloody knives in the barber shop. I mean, I did nothing good about that. I can't imagine.
It's like Sweeney Todd, but no.
Exactly what it'd be like. Yeah. But on the other hand, we do like doing them because they are fun and sometimes they actually end up adding to the story. I mean, the perfect example of that is Leah Brahms. She came up in one of the very first Mirror series, and she sort of popped up now and again in ways that actually end up tying to the story more importantly than you might expect. And for some reason, we've had artists, JK and others have done such a great job of drawing her, seeing her as an evil mirror version has always been kind of a kick to me.
I love mirror drunken hot mess Brahms.
Yeah,
And especially, I mean, JK in the final episode of the first series, when they're at the banquet and she's already been overserved, and she's like at the table and she's like in her head is like, oh, Mariasa, that's a toss up.
One of the comics that kind of reminds me of is an old favorite I had from Marvel, which was a 6-issue, I think 5 or 6 issue miniseries called Identity Disc. And it was really cool because ultimately you didn't know how it was going to end up. And I feel it's kind of the same way here with this thing too, is there's a lot of stuff happening. There's a lot of moving parts. Everybody has their own motivations. So we really don't know how this thing is going to really wrap up. And that's, I think, pretty interesting. And I know you can't tell me anything, but I'm just giving you my personal fan opinion of what's going on.
That's one of the best things about mirror books is the it's wide open where to take things. And that's kind of where a lot of the fun. And also the fact that, you know, with the mirror books, characters can have greed-based motivations and personal motivations that you shouldn't have in the more utopian classic Roddenberry.
Yeah, there was a point in one of the mirror stories where we stressed more this idea that getting ahead and making something for yourself is a core element of sort of philosophy and thought for Terrans in the mirror universe. And
yeah.
And we try to adhere to that in the mirror stories we've told, that as opposed to Roddenberry's sort of utopian idea in the Prime universe, that self-centered, get yourself ahead thinking is what drives people in the mirror universe. And that is sometimes the thing to focus on rather than them being mirror versions or opposites. They are self-centered and all about themselves in a way.
Yeah.
that motivates all of their thinking. And that's something that I think we have found consistently helps to make those mirror stories workable in a way that just thinking of them as mirror opposites does not.
Yeah.
I can interject in that thought too. Like, I think a great example of that is Data, because, you know, in the Star Trek TNG movies and the actual TV series, he's learning to be very much, you know, the opposite of the mirror universe. You know, Data in the show is very much about giving as much as he can of himself, and ultimately does make a major sacrifice that we see in Nemesis. Whereas the Data we're looking at right now in the mirror universe, he's learning a whole different set of human traits, and
he's learning to be selfish.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's what they pat him on the back for.
Yeah, they absolutely do. They say, now you're getting it, you know, and that it's like all philosophy seems to be about the idea of self-priority. And Data is the best way to look at that, because both Datas are trying to learn to be more human, but because humanity is so different, they're learning opposite lessons.
And Mirror Data did not have people encouraging him to be human when he was a young android in the same way that Prime Data did. And so that's why Mirror Data struggles more sometimes with dealing with humans, because he didn't have a sort of background, people trying to encourage him how to be a nice human. He had either people having him be a work slave on the mining planet, or he had people around him who are all thinking in terms of doing things for themselves. And that to Mirror Data is as new as as anything else could be, because he hasn't been exposed to that either.
That was also one of the unexpected things that came with the series. When you have like strong characters that you can then take in different directions, sometimes they go in ways you don't expect. I mean, I think I would have expected, most people thought we would do something with the Data-Geordi relationship, because that's so important in Next Gen. But as we were writing it, the notion of this Barclay Data relationship seemed to could make a lot more sense, and it kind of surprised us how big a part it played in the whole series.
Yeah, I think the way that Mirror Barclay and Mirror Geordi turned out was maybe not what we've even expected at first, but I think it actually made them more interesting than if they had been sort of more sort of simple mirror versions of themselves.
So my question that kind of follow up on all of this here is, what comes after the Mirror War? Are the Mirror Universe characters going to cross paths with the Prime Universe again? Is this the end, or is this just the beginning?
I don't know.
Got nothing for you on that one.
Yeah.
That's pretty much the answer I was expecting. So yeah,
Question mark.
I mean, you totally delivered on that one. So yeah, I get it. So, between the Q conflict you talked about earlier, between this enormous mirror universe saga you guys have got going on here, you've written some real serious Star Trek epics. So I'm kind of curious, is there still like a dream Star Trek series that you want to do that you haven't been able to do yet? Or is this mirror universe kind of like filling that gap for you?
I think for now, the Mirror Universe has been doing it lately. I mean, there's a couple other projects that we'd like to do. There's at least one or so that we've sort of talked to CBS about in the past, and it might come around on that as well. I think Star Trek comics can be hard because, especially right now, you've got a lot of new Star Trek coming out, and it's difficult to sometimes work around what else is going on in the franchise. So we don't know what we'll be doing next with these kind of projects. And we look at that and see where things might go.
A lot of times what we do will depend on kind of zigging where they zag, in that, if the movies and now with all the TV shows, if they're all handling a certain thing, then the comics don't want you to kind of mess with that stuff because they're playing with it. So and luckily Star Trek has become such a vast catalog of concepts that we'll go, okay, well, you guys are not playing with this, and we'll do that. So a lot of times it becomes a matter of giving them the stuff they need that does interfere with what they're doing.
Yeah.
And the good thing about the last two big projects we've done, this and the Q conflict, is that they're both such wide-ranging stories that we can take elements from everything and kind of like plug them in and use them. And it kind of like, if there's particular bits that we haven't gotten to yet or that we want to, we were still playing with facets of it, which is nice.
Yeah, I mean, we recently did a Deep Space Nine story that was basically a sort of murder mystery / psychological thriller.
That's too long to sacrifice for anybody out there who wants to check it out.
Exactly. And that's a good example of something that fits into the Star Trek universe, but it's not going to be stepping on whatever the next Discovery story is going to be that we don't, we may or may not even know about.
both in series and in tone, it was not anywhere near what they were all doing. So it was a nice, good fit in there.
Yeah, and I like stories like that. I mean, that was a lot of fun. We sort of worked out a lot of the details with that particular story with CBS in some fun ways. I think that was a really nice. I've heard some people say that nice compliments about it, that it seemed like a real Deep Space Nine story, which is what we were going for. We really wanted to tell. It's sometimes just nice not to tell a story that's some sort of giant epic with Q and everybody from the entire Star Trek universe. Like, well, what about a nice Deep Space Nine story that actually fits into that universe and peels back a look at a particular character. In the case of ours, it was Odo, and we got to see Odo sort of in his realm, what he did best. And that's what I really enjoyed about it was, well, that's what Odo was there for. And that's what he did. That's what he was good at doing. And oddly enough, in our story, he actually kind of struggles with it. Doesn't do a great job until towards the end.
I love the epics, but sometimes it's nice to do a bottle show.
Yeah, exactly. And so the epics are fun, but I really enjoyed that Deep Space Nine story too. I thought it was a lot of fun, and we had some great art and great coloring on that story. There's fantastic stuff.
So what you're saying is the next series you're going to work on is going to be Star Trek Babies, where we get the Rascals but even younger. All right, guys. So as we come to a close here, this show isn't just about focusing on Star Trek. I also like to kind of get a more bigger picture of who you guys are as human beings. And I would imagine that throughout your creative time working in comics and other industries as well, that you guys have probably had like one piece of advice you got from somebody that's always stuck with you and been very important to how you live and do your work. What's the best piece of advice you've ever gotten from someone else about your profession?
This wasn't so much advice I got from somebody because, as we kind of alluded to earlier, David and I both came to being freelance writers kind of unexpectedly. And so it was never a thing where we actually had advice. We kind of been finding our own way. And one thing people do ask me is, how do you get into comics? And I always say, well, it's tricky because nobody gets in the comics the same way. And after you do it, they board up the way you got in so no one else can do it.
Yeah.
So it's tricky. But one thing I do tell people a lot, and this is advice no one gave me, I just had to learn it myself just through working with Chris Ryle on the website, is that the best thing you can ever do if you really want to be a writer in any capacity is just be writing every day. I when I was working on the website for Kevin Smith with Chris Ryle, we updated that site every day for 3 years, and not a day went by that we didn't have new content. We were editing and writing. We did the daily entertainment news, so I had to have like 5 good jokes every day. And what that did for me was it kind of completely broke me of the idea of writer's block. When you have to write every day, there's no writer's block. It becomes a muscle, and you only get that muscle from just daily use. And the thing I tell people is, if you do want to be writing, write every day. And the other thing is, and this is the thing I get a lot from people who want to be both novelists or comic writers, is finish. Everyone's starting a novel, everyone's starting a comic or a project. Finish it, even if it's not what you want, even if it's not as good as you think it can be. You can always rewrite something, but finish the project. Have it be done with it, and so that you can go back and really evaluate it. That's also the kind of advice that you almost do have to learn for yourself. Because if someone would have told me that before I started working on the website, I wouldn't have listened to it. You have to kind of be in that zone where this is my profession now. This is what I'm doing, and that is the kind of for us over the years. Because sometimes we'll get lots of lead time on a project and lots of time to work on it. And sometimes I say, this just fell through, so now we need this new series. Can you get us a script in 4 days? And that would be terrifying when we first started, but now it's all right. If we have to, we can do that. David, what do you think?
Well, what I'd add to that is a couple things. One thing is that the finish things is a good one. I mean, James Gunn, the director, he tells people that all the time on Twitter. He says, finish it up. Don't leave your projects unfinished. Get them done. He tells people all the time, you got to rewrite things. And that's all good. I think that's important. I mean, it is important that, you're not going to win anybody by saying, I've got this great idea and then never have anything in hand. The sort of cautionary tale I have about the write every day thing, which I think is true, but as someone who struggled with writer's block myself sometimes, always know in the back of your mind that you could be the person who writes every day, and that may not get you a single humbug for the rest of your life. There is no guarantee that you're going to get a project by writing every day.
Oh no, for sure, 100%.
And
I think if Harlan would hear what he would say, writing every day doesn't matter if you suck.
Yes, he would. Then he'd show you his pocket knife. So what I would say, don't make that the be all and end all of your life and think that if I don't do this, there's nothing else for me and that's all I can do. And I've had a lot of jobs in my life. I've done a lot of different things, and don't think that any one of those things is the only thing you could be able to do, or that's the thing that if I do it enough, I'll become so great at that people will be throwing me something. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't happen. So that's the cautionary tale about that.
To add to what you're saying, and I think you're 100% right. But the key is, when the perfect opportunity comes along and you get your shot, at least then you're ready for it.
Yes.
Yeah. But be aware that it is a matter of things lining up so that your opportunity comes up. And it'll come up. I do believe that, but it might be years. You never know. So it's a matter of being prepared for opportunities.
I wouldn't count on it.
And this is why this works. It's a yin and yang.
I mean, it could happen, yeah, but I would say don't stake your life on it, or more importantly, don't stake your happiness on it.
100%. 100%.
And that's really important. It doesn't matter if it's comic books or anything else. I wouldn't stake your happiness on anything like that, because you never know how things will turn out. And there are always forces that are behind the scenes you don't know about. I mean, we've had projects where a licensor or a publishing company had to make a change for various reasons, had nothing to do with what we were doing. Wouldn't matter if we'd have written a day or not, that project wasn't going to happen anymore. And that's just how things go.
And these are projects, by the way, that were like, underway, we'd been paid for, and then they just didn't happen. So what, and then what do? You just go, all right, what's the next thing?
Yeah, that's why I don't get, sometimes people love to ask us about famous unfinished or unwritten stories. And, they want to know, what are these? What were they? And it's like, well, I got a ton of stories like that, but A, I probably shouldn't be telling them to you. And then B, do you really want to know about them? Because it didn't happen anyway.
But C, they might come around again.
Right. They very well could. And so
if I've got this in my back pocket, I'm not just giving it out for free when, depending on who's in charge at some studio, it could actually happen.
No, and it's, another way to think about this too is that, think back to Star Wars and think about how many different answers George Lucas gave when people asked him about new Star Wars.
There's going to be 6. There's going to be 9. There's going to be 12. Yeah.
How many different answers do you tell people? And he made decisions he made for his own reasons, and also because there were unresolved forces behind him and his personal life and his professional life that, made things go the way they did. And so that's why I don't want to get too caught up sometimes in the, that famous unwritten story. It's like, oh boy, yeah, how many of those are there? And what are they going to do for you now? So, my answer to that question is really don't get too caught up. Yeah, sort of like, Yoda to Luke, don't get too caught up in things.
Fair enough. I like how we end the Star Trek podcast with a Star Wars quote, by the way.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Because Star Trek wouldn't do that line.
No.
Shots fired. So, as kids who grew up watching the original Trek series, reading the Gold Key comics, now you guys are part of the Star Trek universe. So I got to ask, what is the best thing about being a part of this massive world?
I like the fact that this universe that meant so much to me as a kid, I got a little chunk of it now, and it's mine, it's ours. And then we added to it. And no matter what, I mean, all storytelling is arbitrary in that stories are canon if they mean something to the reader. So somebody could come along in 20 years and say that all the IDW comics never happened. And my answer then would be, no, they totally happened, because I know somebody out there who's got the book in their hands and they told me they like it, and that story means something to them. So again, I know we keep going back to Harlan, but that's Harlan kind of loomed large for me. Harlan always said that, the only thing that matters after I'm gone is the stories, because no one's going to remember my name and there's not going to be a statue of me, but those stories will be around forever. And that's kind of how I feel about it. I mean, the stories we've told, they mean something to people who like Star Trek, and they're going to be a part of it. That, to me, is kind of like one of the best rewards about this.
Yeah, that's the fun part for me too. I mean, I like the fact that people can read some of these stories that I've worked on, and someone that, hey, that fits in with Star Trek as I see it, and I enjoyed reading that, and it made a lot of sense. And it made a lot of sense within the universe, and maybe most important in some ways, it fit within that canon. And something we haven't had a chance to talk about too much here, but Scott and I work really hard to fit even the mirror stories within the canon of Star Trek, because we know that matters for people. I mean, and when things don't fit into Star Trek, readers and viewers know, and they not very happy about it. And so I think we really try to make it so that someone could read our comic and say, hey, look, that could be an episode. I mean, the best praise we got for that recent Deep Space Nine story was people who said, that would have been a great Deep Space Nine episode. We really liked that. That like someone's actually telling me a new Deep Space Nine story.
Yeah.
So
we work so hard. That's kind of always been our first question with the story is, could this be an episode?
Yeah. And I think that's what I like to think about with these. I like to think that someone would think that, and I mean, we don't write. we don't write our Star Trek stories so that they have an Aesop's fable kind of, oh, here's the lesson you learned today at the end of the story. But I think that even in our mirror stories, we do try to write it so that there's a message there about those characters that rings true to a reader and can think of it as an extension to what they already know about those characters. And to me, that's really important. I find it satisfying that even Mirror Troy, as weird as she is, makes sense within that mirror Star Trek universe. And someone could think, yeah, that makes sense to me. That's how she would be. And that, I think that's a lot of what matters to both Scott and I, as far as these stories go, is that, and in the Harlan sense of it, is someone will remember that story later on. I mean, there's definitely some satisfaction in that idea that we contributed to that and people think of it that way.
I mean, not that I can say from personal experience, but as someone who's read a lot of things like Star Trek comics and other franchises as well, it's a real double-edged sword to work on this kind of a product because you're basically being held up against the TV show or whatever the franchise is, originally based from. So, and you got to make it fit into that universe, like you just said. So, I got to tell you guys, as a fan, I'm legitimately all goosebumpy right now talking to you guys because you're both just doing such an amazing job on all the Trek books you've worked on. I've really enjoyed them. Among all the communities I'm in that talk about comics, I've never seen a bad word about any of the stuff you're working on, and I can tell you every month everybody's very excited for what's happening in the Mirror Wars. So I just want to say for all the fans out there, thank you so much for all of your efforts, all of your hard work. It's really some great stuff you guys are doing right now. So thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for writing some real wonderful comics.
It's great for us to hear, and also in some ways it's kind of been harder the last couple of years because we used to be able to go to conventions and hear a little bit of that from people face to face.
Because we really work in a vacuum. And the last 2 years with no conventions, we really don't get that kind of like chance to interact with the readers. So I mean, that's great to hear. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, it's nice to hear, and getting all those details right is hard. I mean, it's a lot of work, and I mean, the amount of time that we spend looking at resources and trying to make sure that what we put into a story is actually. And I mean, down to the simplest things like, the way a ship works, the way a ship looks, the way a character acts. There's a lot of stuff.
And the bigger picture stuff is making sure that a plot element hasn't been done in one of the 7 or 8 Star Trek series with so many episodes.
I know.
That is the really tricky part, especially of the Star Trek universe, is that there's so many plots that have already been done. So finding your way through that can be.
Well, I mean, setting Enterprise aside, you've got 3 7-year runs of Star Trek stories, plus everything after Enterprise, and it's difficult. I mean, sometimes people like to compare Star Wars and Star Trek, and at least in Star Wars, you don't have as many individual episodes to deal with. You're getting there now, maybe, but it certainly didn't in the past.
They pluck things from their comics and novels that they want to use. But they're not beholden to all that stuff.
No.
And Star Trek, you're beholden to everything that's appeared on screen happened.
Yeah, I mean, part of the way the Trek comics and actually even the Trek novels work is that they are canon relative to the original show, but they may or may not be canon relative to each other, which is something that people have a hard time understanding. I think sometimes getting their mind around that is that even within IDW Comics, we can't guarantee every single IDW comic that is canon with each other, but they all have to be canon with the TV shows and the movies. So it's sort of like a spider, and the tendrils that are legs that come out of that spider are like tentacles, but they don't always go in the same directions.
Well, listen, I could spend another 2 hours just kissing your guys' butts and telling you how great you are, but I'm going to save that for hopefully one day when I get out to your neck of the world. And I can hopefully meet you guys at a convention out in California. That'd be so cool to do. But again, thanks so much for all the great work you guys are doing. And the Mirror universe has grown so much, I think, because of you guys. I mean, I've now got Mirror Picard and all the Mirror characters in my Star Trek Timelines app, which is so cool. And I'm really hoping Playmates gets around to doing some Mirror universe Picard figures and things like that. That'd be so cool to have some toys, these things. And these are things you guys created.
That'd be cool.
So for anybody out there who wants to check out some of the work we've talked about today, we are going to have links to Amazon and a few other places where you can pick up all the different books they've written. And of course, right now, check it out, Star Trek Mirror Wars. It's on, I was going to say newsstands, but no one has newsstands. Go to your local comic book shop, support them, go buy some comics, you guys. So David, Scott, thank you so much for joining us here today. Really been a wonderful time.
Thanks.
Thank you. Our pleasure.
That's it for this week's episode of Trek Untold. Until next time, please don't forget to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And if you're in a position to financially support the show, please consider becoming a supporter over on patreon.com/trekuntold, or pick up some merchandise from our Redbubble store. If you're looking for direct links for any of these things, links will be right in the show notes. If you have any questions or comments for the show, or would like to suggest a guest, or discuss any sponsorship ideas with us, send me a message at trekuntold@gmail.com. Thank you for listening to Trek Untold and for continuing to support this show. I hope you'll come back next time to learn more stories about Star Trek and beyond. Until then, I'm Matthew Kaplowitz, and always remember, fortune favors the bold.
Trek Untold is sponsored by TrekSphere.com, promoting fan-produced Star Trek content in all forms, is powered by the RageWorks podcasting network, and is affiliated with Nerd News Today.